All right, I want to make sure and give you plenty of time, Whitney. So let's get going, and I'm sure a few more folks will be coming in. So uh, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And thanks so much for joining the Work Institute today for our webinar featuring Whitney Martin. She's going to be talking about hiring assessments, reducing bias, improving accuracy, and increasing employee retention. I met Whitney, gosh, 5+ years ago, and we've talked a number of times, and I just have so much respect for Whitney and the work that she does at Proactive Consulting. And so we've been trying to find ways to work together, and we thought the best way to start was to have her present some of her expertise. So Whitney has a real passion around the field of surveys and assessments, a self-professed data nerd. Who has a master's degree in the area of human resource management and evaluation. I have known of Whitney's work for a number of years, and she's really, really good at what she does. She's been a really highly sought after speaker. Her SHRM sessions are always packed, and she is very highly rated. So Whitney, I can't thank you enough for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm like you said, we've been talking just about how much synergy there is between what Work Institute does and what my company does in terms of really attacking the retention problem from so many different angles. And so I'm really excited about this. And, you know, the blessing and curse of this day and age we are in with the webinar is that, you know, a lot of people sign up for things knowing that they can get the recording and watch it later. So totally appreciate those of you that did show up live today. It certainly makes it easier on me as a presenter. And I'm going to look to you guys to do some heavy lifting in the chat when I ask questions so that this can be a really dynamic experience. So again, appreciate it and look forward to getting started. So with that, I want to ask you, what does this image mean to you? When you see this and you know that we're here today to talk about hiring, what does this image conjure for you? And go ahead and use the chat and maybe give me some examples of what comes to mind when you see this image on the screen. So certainly we think it's kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? But I'm wondering if you've ever experienced such a thing. Yeah, hidden challenges with the candidate. So maybe we thought we were going to get something based on the interview and the selection process, and we end up getting something a little bit different than what we expected, right? Looks can be deceiving. You all don't always get what you expect, right? Especially in interviews, because you know, a lot of people are pretty capable of pulling off a certain persona for, you know, at least a couple hours. And then when they show up to work, you're like, man, where's that person I interviewed, right? Can you go back to doing the medication that you were doing that day, right? So absolutely. So I think this is something that most of us have experienced, this kind of idea that we thought we were making a good hiring decision, but something really different showed up. And so my second question is, what is the pain of making a poor hire? So go ahead and use the chat. Tell me what you think when you think about, you know, is this a big deal? Is it a big deal if we make a poor hire? What is kind of the pain associated with that? It impacts other employees, absolutely. Yes, so expensive, absolutely. Frustrations, wasted time, waste of time and money. And so absolutely, and that comes in many shapes and forms, right? So we certainly have the cost of turnover itself, right? If we're hiring the wrong people, there's a chance we're gonna have to replace them. We know that's timely, it's expensive, but we also have that lost productivity. We have damaged customer relationships sometimes. You know, and I think the Work Institute has some really amazing statistics around how this affects other employees. And really, you know, some of the turnover, a significant percentage of turnover that happens is caused by organizations that hire people that maybe they shouldn't have hired in the first place, who end up making poor teammates or that aren't pulling their weight, or, you know, the one apple that's spoiling the bunch and really impacting the culture. There's also some risk involved because now we may have to be going through the process of getting rid of somebody that we maybe shouldn't have hired in the first place. And that can be challenging. We can end up with, lawsuits and just poor reputation in the community. All sorts of things can happen. So I think we would all agree that this is a big problem, and something we want to avoid. So my last question for you, and I don't need you to chat on this one, but I want you to think to yourself, think about the process you used when you hired your absolute best employee. What were the steps that candidate went through to go from a faceless applicant all the way through to this wonderful person who you brought in and everybody was just blown away? There were probably some steps there, right? Some applications, some screens, some checks, some other things. Now I want you to think about the process you used when this wolf in sheep's clothing slipped through the cracks. What did you do differently both of those times? The answer is probably nothing, right? I mean, you have a process in place and it's supposed to work. It's supposed to help us weed out the wolf in sheep's clothing and get the best people. It's just that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I believe there are two reasons that this happens. First is that we are relying on a combination of data points that aren't as consistently accurate or as consistently predictive as they could be. And we're going to spend a majority of our webinar talking about the actual validity of some of these common screening practices and how helpful they are in predicting job performance. But I think the second reason it happens is that we don't always have a clear enough vision of what we're selecting for. So let me give you an example. Here's your typical job posting, right? You post a job, we've got some sort of education requirement, we've got some experience that we either require or we would prefer. Maybe you have 5 years in a management role or 10 years in IT in a manufacturing environment, whatever those things are. And then we're going to list some specific knowledge, skills, traits, and abilities that we want people to have. So maybe that there's a subject matter that we need them to be familiar with or some software and equipment. We also want them to have attention to detail, be organized, have good interpersonal skills, both written and verbal. We want them to be independent and or a good team player. They need to learn quickly and be an excellent problem solver and critical thinker. Sounds about like I just summed out about 90% of job postings, right? And so what will often happen is that companies will call me in and ask me to help them answer this question of all the things we can screen for in applicants. What's going to be those couple things that really truly differentiate, that actually correlate with the metrics that matter to our organization? And so what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll usually start by reviewing their job postings, their position descriptions, maybe their mission, vision, values, their onboarding stuff, performance evaluations, right? What are people actually being held accountable to? And I'll go in and synthesize all of the things that this organization says they are looking for, all of the things that they mention that seem to be important to performance in that organization. And I'll come up with a list that looks about like this. Now, please, spoiler alert, I'm not endorsing this, okay? But when I go, this is very typical. This was actually a financial services company, but I've done it in healthcare and in manufacturing and in logistics and in everywhere else. This is pretty typical. When I pull together the list of all the traits and attributes that are mentioned in the job postings and in the performance evaluations and in the mission, vision, values, this is about a pretty typical list of what we say we want in an employee. Now, let me ask you this. Is it reasonable to think that we could accurately gauge all of these things in an interview? Probably not, right? Is it likely that some managers are focusing more heavily than others on some of these things, creating some inconsistency in what we're actually selecting for? And is it likely that all managers are using consistent, reliable, accurate measures to gauge these things? And it's like all of a sudden when you see this, it's like light bulb, right? Like, well, no wonder we're maybe not always doing the best job of picking the best people. We don't know exactly what we want, of all these things that are undoubtedly important to performance. We're not really sure which are the most important, which are the true differentiators, which are the non-negotiables, and do we have systems in place that allow our HR people and our hiring managers to really look at these in a consistent and predictive way? And so that's where we need to get to, right? We need to create a selection system that is effective at measuring the things that really, really matter. And this is going to start with understanding how effective some common selection criteria are at predicting job performance. So that's going to lead us to our agenda today. We're going to spend the first half of our time talking about why you use assessments at all. How do they bring value? Where do they supplement some of the other things that you're doing in your selection process? And what are the most effective methods when it comes to actually predicting job performance? And then we're going to switch to how. How do you apply this in your organization to specifically figure out how this would work for your specific needs, your specific objectives? And so that's kind of how we're going to format today. As Danny said, a little bit about me, I'm just the total data nerd. I really enjoy helping organizations get good, actionable, reliable data around their people that they can act on with confidence. I've been doing this for about 2 decades, and a vast majority of my time is spent helping organizations with their pre-hire selection strategy, really creating something that's very concise and fair and accurate and predictive, and really making sure all those pieces are working together. So I want you to take a minute and think about, of these 5 selection criteria, which is what we're going to spend our time talking about, which of these do you think actually has the highest predictive power, the highest correlation with ultimately how somebody performs on the job? And you can go ahead and type in A, B, C, D, or E for which one you think is most predictive. And while you're typing that in, I'm going to tell you what we're going to do next is we're going to actually look at some data, all right? Some predictive validity coefficients that tell us just how effective each of these are at actually predicting job performance. And I want you to understand that when I share that data with you, it is not my opinion. It is not data that comes from any assessment test vendors or anything like that. There are 2 sources for this data. One is a seminal academic research piece that was done by Schmidt and Hunter that actually looked at 100 years worth of workplace productivity research. So they said, of all these studies that we've been doing over the last 100 years to figure out how personality correlates with job performance and how knowledge correlates with job performance, what can we really conclude? And so they did what's called a meta-analysis and looked at all that data, put it all together and said, what are these broad conclusions we can draw? So that is one of the studies that I'm going to be quoting. The other one is a meta-analysis of 81 different studies about this stuff. So this is all very well-researched, well-founded, well-respected academic research. So I'm seeing in our votes, we have some B, some D, some E, and some no idea. So good. I'm glad that we don't have everybody in the room all agreeing, because I think that'll make it more interesting for us. So let's end the suspense, and I'm going to talk to you about each of these and how effective they are. So let's start with job experience. I mean, this is pretty much the first thing we look for in a resume screen, right? I mean, it's what we use most of the time to sort people into that call back, don't call back pile. There was a study of over 95,000 job postings last year, and it found that 82 to 84% of them stated some sort of experience requirement. Now, oddly, 61% of entry-level jobs also required more than 3 years, which is a bit of a conundrum, right? But clearly what this tells us is that we really like our job experience. We really think this is important. It's something that we rely heavily on. So let's see how effective that is. 0.06. So that means it's about it contributes about 1.2% to predicting job performance. This is a really tiny number to give you some perspective, right? We're looking at a kind of a 0 to 100 scale. The closer you get to 100, the more predictive it is. And we're at a 6. And so why is this? Well, what this study of 81 different studies found was that past experience only correlates with job performance at 0.06. And in fact, it only correlates with training performance at 0.11. So what that means is probably the reason you want to hire somebody with past relevant similar experience is that you assume that they can then come in the door and get up to speed a little faster than those people who don't have experience, right? But these people who have experience, that's only correlating with their performance in your training and your onboarding at a 0.11. So it's not even giving us that level of prediction. So why is this? Why doesn't past experience translate to future performance? I mean, gosh, this is, I feel like, really undermining some long-held beliefs here. But if you think about it, even if the job that this person had previously had a similar title, similar responsibilities, the company they were at was a different culture. There were different support mechanisms in place, different responsibilities. They had a different boss. right? Different performance expectations, different pay, rewards, and incentives, different life circumstances. Maybe there's a reason that they're looking for a job right now, and that's that something has happened in their life and there's been some change, and obviously that's going to impact how they're going to perform at their new job as well. And in fact, those years of experience, the number of years that we like to put in our job postings, have zero correlation with performance. And that's because number of years don't necessarily equal number of successful years, right? This person may bring dated practices into your organization. Their experience, if they've been there a long time, may even be less up to date with current skill sets. So not only are our experience requirements basically very ineffective in terms of predicting who's going to be a good performer for us, but they can also be a subtle source of introducing bias. So women have generally 14% less experience than men, and certain groups are certainly underrepresented in certain jobs in certain industries. So this is not only, you know, something that can create some prediction challenges for us, but can also be an introduction of bias. And I just absolutely love this quote on the screen, that experience isn't a proxy for skill or talent or attitude or work ethic or anything other than the ability to hold on to a particular job for a certain period of time. So this can be a little bit challenging for us, but I think it's a really interesting thing for us to take a look at. So after job experience, usually the next thing we look at when we're screening those resumes is education, right? Do they have the education experiences that we want them to have? So how does this correlate with job performance? Okay, it's a little higher. We're at a 0.10 prediction. And so again, why does this not necessarily correlate? Just because somebody has a degree or you know, some sort of education in the field that we think is relevant, why isn't that a better predictor of their performance? Well, you know, the work environment is nothing like the academic environment. Academic institutions aren't designed to cope with rapid changes in the industry right now. Universities are generally believed to be about 10 years behind on the teaching curriculum. And we all know that the cost of pursuing a higher education degree is not sustainable, right? We've seen the studies, we know about the debt that kids, right, are coming out of college with, and that they're not getting the ROI, they're not getting the pay that they were promised as a result of that. We know that this bubble is going to burst. Not to mention that younger generations are already just seeking degrees at a lower rate than previous generations did. They also don't buy cars as much as previous generations because they can call an Uber, and they don't necessarily get degrees because they can watch a YouTube video. And I'm being silly, obviously, but there is certainly a shift towards wanting more on-demand learning, stuff that is more up to the minute and more fluid. And so I think that, you know, again, that shift is happening. Not only that, but this is also a potential source of bias. People coming out of academic institutions are not going to look the same for every race, socioeconomic status, et cetera. In fact, as we were sitting here prepping for this call, I was on LinkedIn and saw kind of an amazing graphic that showed that the more money your family has, the better degree. I mean, and that's kind of, we probably somewhat know that on some level, but the data is pretty shocking in terms of, you know, the lower income people just don't have the same chances at a higher education degree. And so, you know, chasing brand names and over-indexing on pedigrees breeds bias, even unconsciously, that can become a blind spot for us as a business. Now, there is starting to be some acknowledgement of this. In 2019 on LinkedIn, the number of postings not requiring a degree increased by 40% in 2020 over 2019. And then there was a 21% increase in job postings talking about skills and responsibility instead of qualifications and requirements. Now, there's a caveat here, of course. If you are out there and you are in healthcare, I don't want my doctor to not have a doctor degree, right? A medical degree. And so obviously there's certain jobs that do require that, and there's reasons why, right? But I'm also going to want to know what that doctor has done to stay up to date because of how quickly things change. And so really understanding that kind of the more up to date, more fluid methods of learning are really showing to have a higher correlation, higher predictive power when it comes to job performance. So why do we get so hung up on education and experience? I mean, those are really the two things we hang our hat on, right? You know, we like to say, have you worked in sales for 3 years? Have you managed people before? Yes or no? I think the reason we get so hung up on this is because it's easy, right? We can ask those questions. It's a yes or no answer, and we can move on because we want to treat those as a proxy. We want to say, okay, if they have this education and they have this experience, they must also have the other stuff we really want, which is the ability to learn, that persistence to stick with it through a degree, some sort of knowledge or skill that we want, right? So we want to think that, we want to assume that because they have that knowledge and experience that they're also bringing to the table the other things that we really need. But if we stopped being so reliant on education and experience, it would open up whole new applicant pools, more diversity of thought, and potentially we would have the opportunity to screen for people that have a higher potential to actually be good for performers for our organization. So how do we shift to focusing on those traits, abilities, and skills that are needed? Well, let's talk about skills and knowledge assessments, right? So what I'm talking about here is these types of assessments. They're, kind of like tests, right? That measure some specific competency, some specific knowledge base, right? So maybe Microsoft Office products, those are really popular. We need to make sure somebody knows how to use Excel or Peachtree or whatever program, right? It might be something like customer service knowledge or skills, sales knowledge. Do they know how to use certain equipment? So like welding or, other types of things. Tons of them in healthcare. We can get very specific tests on, do they know everything about phlebotomy that they are supposed to? And so that's really what we're talking about with these skills and knowledge tests. They're very concrete, they're very tactical. And so how much do they correlate with ultimately predicting job performance? Really, they don't. And you're thinking, well, geez, that seems surprising. So before we start to knock these, let me tell you why this number comes out to 0 and why I think there is still benefit in doing it. So 2 concepts here. One is prediction versus confirmation. So what we're doing with these tools is confirming that somebody actually knows what they say they know, but we're not really predicting job performance, right? Well, that's because of narrow versus broad predictors. What we're measuring with these types of assessments is something incredibly narrow. Do you know how to use Excel? Do you know how to insert an IV? How much of ultimate job performance really comes down to that little skill set, right? It's so much more than that, because usually when people fail on the job, it's not necessarily because their lack of technical ability. It's usually because of attitude or work ethic or interpersonal skills or motivation or willingness to be coached or temperament or emotional intelligence, right? And the list goes on. So usually those are the types of things that ultimately have a higher correlation with job performance. And so what we're actually measuring with these is, does this candidate come in the door with the knowledge that they say they have right now? And that's a weird way to say it. So what we're actually confirming is that, they have this exact knowledge skill set today. And how helpful is that to you? Well, let me ask you, do you believe me when I say the rate of change has been accelerating for a while now, and COVID even kicked it up another notch? Right? Think about the amount of stuff we expected people to learn, the amount of change in the way they operate that we expected over the last 2 years. Anyone heard the terms upskilling or reskilling recently? Anybody sick of those terms yet? I mean, every study I see coming out of these institutions is about how much upskilling and reskilling we're going to need. In fact, the World Economic Forum is saying that 50% of all employees are going to need reskilling by 2025. And so the reality is that skills and knowledge are not like fine wine, right? They're not appreciating with age. There's a little bit more like getting stale, like bread, right? A 2021 Gartner study showed that the total number of skills required for a single job has been increasing by 10% year over year since 2017. That is staggering.
Wow.
The number of skills required for a single job has been increasing 10% year over year since 2017. The amount of stuff we are expecting people to know is just greatly increasing. The half-life of learned skills is now believed to be about 5 years. So after about 5 years, a lot of your skill and knowledge is obsolete. And then again, the World Economic Forum is talking a lot about how much we are going to need to be reskilling. So knowledge becomes obsolete fairly quickly. It's more important to know if the person has the ability to learn, if they have the motivation to learn, right? Because if they have those things, we can probably teach them, and we're going to have to teach them anyway, this stuff as things continue to change. So are these skills and knowledge tests useless? I actually don't think so. In fact, I think they can be an incredibly helpful tool and a very effective way to screen for that relevant skill and knowledge that we need, much more so than just assuming that the past experience and the education are going to predict that, right? So instead of assuming that somebody, that has a certain degree or a certain amount of experience actually is coming in with the knowledge and skill we need, why don't we put everybody on an equal playing field and use knowledge and skills tests that are very strategically tied to your specific roles and what they need to know for that job? I think it's a great way to increase kind of the fairness and consistency of the process. But again, you need to know what you're getting. You're getting confirmation that they're coming in the door knowing a certain thing right now, and also knowing that what they need to know is probably going to change over time. So how do we then again shift to some of that motivation, that ability to learn? Well, that's what we're going to look for next. So personality. Probably everybody would agree that there are certain personality factors that matter, right? They either matter to performing certain jobs, or they matter because, we require certain, stuff to fit within our culture. So personality, I mean, yeah, it probably plays a role, right? So what's our predictive validity coefficient? All right, we're up to 0.22 correlation between personality and performance on the job. And in fact, the 0.22 is actually for conscientiousness. So you may have heard this term, the big 5 personality traits. There are basically kind of 5 different buckets that all the adjectives that you could use to describe personality fall into, and that's the big 5. And conscientiousness is the most highly correlated with job performance. And I think that's because people who are more conscientious tend to be more rule-oriented, right? They tend to stay at jobs longer because they're more conscientiousness. They pay more attention to details. They follow the rules better. And so, there is a higher correlation with more conscientious people and job performance. But I think the reason that some of the rest of these don't translate as highly is because that we're not mapping them to a specific job. So if we were to say, is being more extroverted a better predictor of success? Obviously the answer is no, right? I mean, in some jobs, being an extrovert is a great thing. In other times, it may be, not as positive of a trait. So for personality to be a meaningful predictor, we need to do a much more strategic job of identifying the traits that are actually differentiating performance in our roles, in our culture, in our organization. And this is more than just intuition. So for example, I have a financial services client. They're in insurance and they have claims adjusters. And claims adjusters is one of those really fun roles. When I'm giving speeches like this, I use them as an example of a kind of role where you might want somebody who's a little bit more cynical in nature, right? Because if you get a claims adjuster who is super trusting, super optimistic, super positive, very Pollyanna rose-colored glasses, they're going to believe every sob story they get, and they're going to be, filling claims left and right till we're out of business. So this is one of those jobs where maybe we want somebody who's a little bit more cynical, a little bit more guarded, a little bit more questioning things, right? So it was really interesting recently when I had this long-term client. We'd been using assessments for a little over a decade. And we said, you know what, it might be time for us to revisit some of the benchmarks that we've established for key roles in the organization. So what we did is we actually looked at how their top performers score on this assessment. We looked at how their bottom performers score on this assessment. And when I went to present the data, I was a little bit nervous because what I found was the top performers were actually a little bit more positive and trusting and optimistic than I would have expected, than intuition would have told me. And I was a little bit nervous about how that was going to go over. And when I presented that data, they were like, oh my gosh, we are so happy to hear this. We have worked so hard over the last 5 years to differentiate ourselves within our marketplace as extremely customer centric, way more so than these other insurance people, right? And so their top performers actually were a little bit more positive and optimistic than your classic claims adjuster. So it's more than just what our intuition tells us is important. I mean, sales is another great example. If I ask anybody what kind of personality traits lend themselves to being a good salesperson, they're going to say they're independent, they're assertive, they're outgoing. Well, guess what? Study after study after study would show you that that's not necessarily true, depending on the type of sale, the type of organization, what you're selling, the type of customer, et cetera. So we need to move beyond intuition and really be data-driven and really strategic in identifying what personality traits actually matter to this role, which ones actually differentiate, and what levels of those traits are going to be optimal in that role. And once we've identified the traits that are meaningful that we want to measure in candidates, that we have a good reason to measure in candidates, we need to find tools that are specifically designed to do that. And not all personality assessments are. So let me give you an example. I'm guessing that if I ask for a show of hands, you've each had experience with a 4-quadrant personality assessment, right? So this could be, any assessment where you fill it out, you check off the words that sound like you, and the results come back and say you are 1 or 2 of these letters or colors or numbers or right? We all know this, right? Animals, there's lots of them out there. And so, these have actually been around a really long time. They actually started in 440 BC when Empedocles, the philosopher, had been observing human behavior. And it was like, I've noticed that people tend to act or react in one of 4 ways. And he called those categories earth, air, fire, and water. This might be coming back from high school psychology class, right? Earth, air, fire, and water were the 4 personality types that he identified. And then a few years later, Hippocrates came along and said, I've noticed the same thing. People tend to act or react in one of 4 ways, but Hippocrates was a doctor. So he labeled those categories blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which is gross. And I don't think any of us want to be those things. And we don't want to use those terms in the workplace. So I'm glad that we've come up with some better tools over the years, but we've essentially been doing this same thing for a really long time. And these really resonate with us, right? I mean, I've gone into organizations and used DISC or Myers-Briggs or Predictive Index, and people really, they get excited, right? They're like, wow, this tool really described me, and it really helps me understand why I react to my coworkers in a certain way and why I gravitate towards certain parts of my job. But the question is this, how helpful are these types of tools, and are they appropriate to use for selection? And I am going to argue no. And let me tell you why. So first of all, a basic description of these types of tools is how people describe themselves in terms of their own style, their tendencies, their preferences. And so I go in and I check off the words that sound like me. And so they are very transparent by nature because they're designed for you to better understand how I describe myself. Now, if I'm applying for a sales role, I probably know certain words are going to be more desirous for you as the employer. And so they can be a little bit more easy to manipulate as a result, because they're pretty straightforward, right? You're checking off 1 of 4 words. I mean, it's, there's not a lot of depth. There's not a lot of complexity to that type of assessment. They're also designed to measure a state versus a trait. So think about, when I talk about these types of tools, I've had people say, when I was younger, I would have filled that out differently. Or, well, are they asking about me at work, or are they asking about me at home? And that's a very valid question, because you might have a very different approach at home than you do at work. Similarly, if you've been on the job market for, a year and you're filling out one of these as a candidate, your answers might be somewhat different than if you've been on a team that really values you for your detail orientation, and they really look to you for that, and they play up that part of you. And so these are really designed to grow and evolve with you over time. It's designed to, in that moment, capture what is an accurate description of your style, your tendencies, your preferences. And while I'm not suggesting that the results are likely to flip-flop every other week, that is certainly not the case, they really are designed to be sensitive to context. So how can you use my results on a 4-quadrant personality assessment to predict how I'm going to go about doing the job a couple years down the road if there's a good chance those results might change over time? And the answer is you really can't. So the retest reliability on these are generally quite low, below Department of Labor recommendations, because they are designed to kind of grow and evolve with you over time. Next thing is ipsative versus normative. So ipsative just means that I'm measuring something in relation to myself. So on this assessment, I'm going to find out that I like data entry more than I like parties. But it's not a normative assessment that says, I like data entry, more than 78% of North American accountants, right? That's a normative assessment. So these are the assessments that take all these mounds of data, and they are able to see how scores distribute on a standard distribution curve, and then compare your results to a certain population. So that might be the working population in North America. It might be all the financial analysts in our state, whatever that population might be. And so a normative assessment is going to be much more statistically robust. It's also going to be much more helpful when your goal is to compare candidates to each other. So you're going to have a relative comparison group to really draw some meaningful conclusions from that data. And then the last thing I'll say is that these are just very one-dimensional, right? With the 4-quadrant assessment, what you're actually measuring is 2 things. And those 2 axes give you those 4 quadrants. So it's something like assertiveness and extroversion is what we're measuring. And like we talked about with the skills test, if what we're measuring is very narrow, there's only certain things that we can predict with that, right? We can't necessarily extrapolate and expect this to predict a broad range of things when we're really only measuring 2 things. And so this is an interesting piece of the puzzle, but there are ways to measure personality that are measuring more stable traits, that are normative, and that are going to be much more recommended for high stakes applications like hiring. Now, absolutely, I think there's a ton of great uses for these assessments when you're doing internal stuff in your company. So, helping people understand themselves better, looking at the team dynamics, figuring out how to tailor your communication and your motivation strategy to certain people. Those are all great uses for these. But there are limited uses when it comes to high stakes things like hiring, again, because of retest reliability, things like predictive validity that we're, are talking about with this. So I spend time talking about this because if I were to do a poll, these are extremely common. Again, we're all kind of familiar with it. These are extremely common in the organizations. And so I want to kind of point out a caveat that there are other types of personality assessments that are going to be more predictive and more useful in that context. The last of our 5 predictive traits we're going to talk about is cognitive ability. And guess what? This is the single best predictor of job performance, period. And so this is sometimes kind of a shock to people, but really it shouldn't be. You know why? Because of that rate of change that we've been talking about. We expect people to learn new things. We expect them to learn it quickly. And if they can't, it's going to be a big problem. Now, we do actually introduce adverse impact with this type of testing. And so I'm not suggesting that we give everybody an IQ test and only hire the smartest people. That would be silly. But there are ways to measure cognitive ability in meaningful and compliant ways. There's a couple different kinds of tests, and it's really about figuring out what's going to be most appropriate for your population. And so we need to be able to show that it's job relevant and that we have data to show why it's important. And if you don't believe that it's important, let me show you what the World Economic Forum says are the most important skills for 2025. Look, top right or top left, analytical thinking and innovation, active learning and learning strategies, complex problem solving, critical thinking and analysis. Bottom right, reasoning, problem solving and ideation. So 5 out of the top 10 of the skills that the World Economic Forum is saying is most critical in the coming years are cognitive. And then we also get some personality, right? Creativity, originality and initiative, resilience and stress tolerance. So it's always going to be about understanding what's going to be most helpful to you. And so, I can't tell you how often I get calls from companies saying, we think we should probably use one of these assessment things. What should we use? And my answer is always going to be, it depends. And then we're going to have a conversation about what's going on. What is it that makes you think you want to have some additional data when you're hiring? What are you trying to predict? Are you having turnover? Is it you just are having people that can't progress through the ranks? Is it that they aren't a good fit with your culture? They're not engaged once they get there? What's going on? Because all of those outcomes are going to have a different thing that predicts it. So it's always going to be about starting on the right of this chart, right? Figuring out what are the outcomes we want to achieve. And then we can back up to figure out what is it that we need to be measuring in candidates that'll actually predict those outcomes. So that's always going to be custom to you. And so take just 1 minute and think about what would hiring better mean in your organization? And go ahead and type in the chat, what would hiring better mean? It would mean more blank or less blank or better blank. And I can give you a couple of ideas of what I commonly hear as you're typing that in. Less turnover. Now, turnover is a fun one. It's almost always the first answer I get, but let me challenge you to think about that in even a more granular way, right? So do we want just less turnover altogether? Do we want to put together some retention initiatives to just keep anybody and everybody in our organization, even if they're poor performers? Probably not, right? So we want to think about turnover in terms of performance and length of their time in your organization. So we want to retain certain people, right? And Danny's got all sorts of great statistics about this turnover thing and why people leave. And so really understanding who we want to retain is really critical. And then are we having turnover issues in the first 90 days, or are we having turnover issues at 3 years? Because the antecedents of those are very different. So we really want to break turnover down and understand exactly why it's happening, when it's happening, and where it's happening, because different things are going to predict those outcomes. You guys also said hiring better would mean happier employees, right? So that's engagement, right? And so there's definitely things that can predict that. We better fit with the culture, more wins, less waste. That's really an interesting one. I don't know, William, which industry you're in, but it's really interesting when you start to look at things like scrap rate and quality and attention to detail. And so we can absolutely predict employees that are going to have less waste in the organization. Maybe it's more less entitlement. I don't have the magic bullet on that one, but I'll let you know. No, there are some things that we can look at about less drama, less entitlement. There are certain things that could be a leading indicator of those things. Better customer satisfaction. So think about this, right? Maybe you want more creativity in the workplace, right? More innovation, or maybe you want less waste, or maybe you want less 90-day turnover. Those are very different objectives. And what you're going to measure in candidates to predict those are also going to be very different. So my point today is that there is no one size fits all. There is no one silver bullet. And if anybody tells you there is, it's because they're trying to sell you something. And that is not my goal. My goal is to really arm you with the right questions to ask, right? What are we really trying to achieve in our organization? And what can we measure in candidates that's going to be predictive of that? Included in the slide deck that the Work Institute is going to send you after this presentation is this list of questions. And I'll encourage you to refer back to this, because these are some good questions to start to help you nail this down for your organization specifically. And I think you'll find that helpful. And then once you've decided what you want to measure, you've got to pick some tools that do it well, that do it in a compliant manner and in a fair way that's in a reduced bias. And so there's a couple different rules of thumb here to help you choose a good test. And maybe you've noticed that I haven't yet mentioned a single assessment by name, and that is by design. First of all, there are too many. There are thousands of assessment instruments on the market. Many of them are very, very good, but they are all designed to do very different things. Some of them are, more appropriate for certain industries. Others are, going to lend themselves to different applications differently. And so, really, we want to make sure that we are understanding what are those decision criteria when we're selecting an assessment. Where do we want it to go in the process? Do we need it to be appropriate for different cultures, different languages? Do we need it to use all over the world, or are we just going to use it in the US? When it comes to picking an assessment, you really want to scrutinize the reliability and validity and adverse impact. And if you didn't go into HR because you love statistics, this may not be the most fun part of your job. You may want to call up an IO psychologist or somebody at your university to really help you scrutinize this reliability and validity data, because it can be a little overwhelming. And then, of course, there's the logistical considerations, right? I am nothing if not a pragmatist. So it doesn't matter to me how statistically robust and scientifically amazing an assessment is. If it's not practical for you to use, it's not going to be helpful, right? So you got to understand, like, how long does it take to complete? What's the cost? Is that a good ROI for the type of position we're hiring before? Does it integrate with our ATS, right? Just different pragmatic logistical considerations when selecting an assessment. And then the last thing is candidate experience. And we haven't talked a lot about this yet, but it may not surprise you to know that I've done some research on it. And believe it or not, candidates actually really appreciate the opportunity to be judged on something that is relevant. They would much rather take an assessment and feel like it's a fair and accurate representation of what they're bringing to the table, rather than whether they wore the right thing to the interview, or whether they answered that one question in just a little bit of a weird way, or whether they had a typo on their resume, right? Those things are not nearly as fair, to the candidates as a way to judge them as an assessment where they were able to really put their best foot forward and show you what they're bringing to the table. So there's actually a lot of really positive ways that you can leverage assessments that will be positive for the candidate experience. Some of them also give a really cool, realistic job preview. Some of them really enable a candidate to tell you a lot about themselves. And so there's some really good stuff that goes along with that. The last thing you're going to do is once you've put an awesome selection process in place, you're going to want to measure the impact, right? If you aren't making a positive impact on the organization, why the heck are you doing it? And there's lots of metrics you can use to show that your selection process has a positive impact on the metrics that matter to your organization. And those are going to look different for every company. And so you really got to think through what matters to our business. And can I show that we are able to select employees that really fulfill that goal? And so again, in your slide packet, you'll have the opportunity to study these a little bit more, but pick a couple metrics that really matter to you and then really be able to tie your selection to that. So to sum up, I wanted just to kind of review the power versus the peril of assessments. When I talk to organizations about assessments, the three biggest pushbacks that I get are, first, they're concerned about bias or adverse impact. Guys, bias enters this process so far upstream, it's hard to even identify the sources anymore. So think about this with me, right? Who even sees your job postings in the first place due to the algorithms on social media and these other platforms you're using? There's a source of bias potentially. And then which candidates your recruiters see because of that, the term matching services that a lot of companies are using with the resumes and the artificial intelligence and this sort of stuff, the machine learning, there's these term matching services, who your recruiters are even seeing, there might be some bias introduced there. Then we're going to screen out a bunch of people based on education and past experience. And we've already talked about that is a way that bias enters the picture. Then there was a Forbes study that said we are 2.1 times more likely to call back a woman who is not a parent than an equally qualified mother. And lest you think that guys are going to escape this, I thought this was even more interesting. There have been studies now that show that organizations are more likely to call back a man who lost his job, so who was fired or laid off, as opposed to one who said he opted out of work to care for his family. Because our biases towards caregivers are so ingrained that it's really difficult to navigate, right? And then at this point, you've got a stack of people that you're interested in, right? That have been weeded out for all these ways, and there's been bias introduced at every step of the way. And now we're going to do an interview, the place in the process that has the most bias, right? I mean, hiring managers decide in the first 30 seconds of an interview whether they're going to hire the person or not and spend the rest of the time justifying their decision. So really assessments is where we're worried about. This is actually the most objective, potentially, as long as you're using good tools, well-developed tools, and you're using them right, and the way that they were intended to be used, this is actually a way to mitigate so much of that bias that is coming in other places, to have that additional objective data point to really balance out our perceptions and the other sources of data we have. So this is really, I would say, a very easily surmountable objection. The next is time and cost, right? Obviously, we know that we're going to be expecting the candidates to spend a little bit of time, and there's going to be a cost associated with that. Compared to the cost of hiring the wrong person, we all know that is a teeny tiny drop in the bucket, right? And again, it's going to come back to that analysis that I mentioned before. We should be able to show that our assessment results are correlated with success on the job. And if we can't do that, then why the heck are we doing it, right? And so we need to be able to show that. And that's certainly something that I can talk to you offline about if you're confused about how you would correlate with some metrics that matter. It doesn't always have to be really challenging. It can actually sometimes be pretty easy to do. So I'd be happy to discuss that. And then the last is that candidate experience. They're like, gosh, right now we have so few people to choose from. Can we afford to make them jump through another hurdle, right? That's a question I'm getting a lot right now with the applicant pool that we have, right? And the question is, short-staffed shouldn't equal short-sighted. And so you absolutely still need to be doing that screening. And again, as we talked about, it can actually be a very positive experience for candidates if we're communicating well, right? If we're communicating how we're making these decisions and how each of these pieces of the puzzle play into that decision. So all of these perils are very surmountable, and the pros can really outweigh the cons.
Hey, Whitney, can I interrupt you for just a second? Because I wanted to go back to your prior slide, because, we're hearing so much right now about applicant tracking systems and about those algorithms that you talked about and how people are being weeded out. And then you bring up the cost. So, I mean, and I realize every organization is going to be different, and I think most of them would be reluctant to potentially put, say, a cognitive assessment at the very front of that process, because it's so many people and some don't even meet, even very basic requirements that might need to be there, even though they're not very predictive. So how do you help companies to understand where that fits into the process?
Danny, I took out 2 slides from this presentation because I knew we'd be short on time, and that was one of them. Oh my gosh. So the reality is I love talking about this stuff so much, and I really want to do it for about 4 or 5 hours. And so I have
know, same with me.
But seriously, there's a funnel, right? And where you put these things in the funnel must be very strategic, and there's going to be pros and cons at every point of that process. And so I would love to talk more about that with anybody who's interested in, and your candidate experience is going to be different at each step. Your ROI is going to be different at each step. And so it really is, there needs to be some intentionality about where do we put these things and what are we hoping to get out of it? And your applicant pool might dictate some of that as well. Do we have the luxury of having 1,000 applicants when we post a job? Because that's going to be a real different scenario than if we're beating the bushes to get 2 or 3. So there's a lot of things that would go into that, that decision process.
And I also wanted to ask you, because you have brought up culture a number of times, and there are organizations that would say hire for culture, not hire for the job. So how do you kind of meld these 2 ideas together when you think about culture versus thinking about just maybe that cognitive ability?
Man, that is the $1 million question.
I know.
It is tricky, but also doable.
Okay.
And so I think it's gonna, there's that analysis process up front when we're figuring out what do we want to measure, what's going to be the true differentiator. In some organizations, that's culture fit. Mm-hmm. I was working with a company, this never came to life for me more than when it was right when COVID started. So, about 1.5 years ago, this company, everybody I talk to says we have a really strong culture and we need people to do, but I had never seen it quite as loud as in this organization, where they really had this, this feedback culture where everybody needed to be able to take feedback and from peers, from underlings, from overlings. And I mean, it was so ingrained that I'm like, man, if you get a maverick in here who is got a big ego, they're going to be out the door in a couple days. And so there, that was one of those where it was like that weighed more heavily in their case than in other organizations where maybe it's really about, we can accept a lot of different kinds of people as long as they're really, into performance. And so it really is that kind of upfront process of dissecting what's going to be the differentiator.
Okay, great.
So again, those kind of the key wrap up, the key takeaways is the vision is the foundation, what we've just been talking about. You can't select the best without defining what the best means for you. And this is the part that I see organizations really skip over. They really haven't taken enough time to pull the reins back and really say, whether it's an assessment or whether it's the interview or whether it's, anything, what are we selecting for? And how do we know that that's the most important stuff, right? Of all the things we can screen for, what's going to be that secret sauce, those 4 or 5 things maybe that are truly driving success. And so, really being intentional about that process, I can't overstate how important that is, because, what happens sometimes, is we maybe start to do some stuff differently. And then a year later, we're still not sure if it's working because we never decided what working meant. And so, really being thoughtful up front is absolutely the most important thing. And then using assessments is going to allow you to infuse some additional objective data into this process to help mitigate that bias and make better decisions overall. And there's a lot of assessments out there, and there's no one size fits all. There's no one best product. It really is going to be determined by what you're trying to measure and some other factors that are going to determine what type of product is going to be the most meaningful and helpful for you. But regardless, I think it is time that we take a fresh look at our screening criteria to ensure that they are effective and fair. Again, this impacts so many things, not just retention and turnover, but also, the engagement of our existing staff, right? There's so many other things that this impacts. After the fact, we are going to send you not only the slides, but also the recording of this as well. And then there's going to be a couple articles attached that I think you might find helpful if you're interested in this topic. When you get that email, take a look at those. And then anybody who wants to discuss how this applies to their unique situation, I am happy to do that. I appreciate the time you've taken today. There are so much nuance in this. Again, in 45 minutes or an hour, I can't, cover all the scenarios. And so I'm happy to have that conversation and just give you any advice I can for your unique situation. So with that, I would love to answer any additional questions that didn't come up or get any additional insight from the Work Institute team on how you see this applying to the work you guys are doing.
Whitney, I hope we didn't talk about this question. It just kind of came to me as you were walking through this, but obviously several people mentioned turnover, and obviously Work Institute, that's a lot of the work we do is working with organizations who have high turnover. And as you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me is that this process of deciding who we're going to select and what processes we're going to use, what tools we might be using, it's also a great time of self-reflection on who we are. And I think that, is it fair to say that a lot of times companies learn a lot about themselves by simply trying to understand better who they're going to hire?
Yes. So remember the second slide I had where I said, here's the list of everything you guys, like any company says you're looking for. I usually present that to the executive leadership team, and it's just like, they're like, oh, wow. That's why we haven't spent enough time really determining what are those key differentiators for us, for our culture, for our position in the marketplace, right? And really making that, those kind of distinctions. And so absolutely, I think it can be an incredibly insightful process to take a look at who do we really want to hire? Who really is a good fit here?
Right. Yeah, and so much of what we do is trying to get beyond just those surface responses and things. You had a slide there that said it's all about the why. And we wrote a book called The Why Factor because it's all about why do people feel the way they do, right? About their organization. And I think sometimes this process can help in that self-reflection of, well, why do we want to do this? Why are we this way? Why do we want our culture to be like this?
Right.
I think there's just so much that can come out of it. We've only got a couple of minutes. I haven't seen Remember Jurassic Park reopened 5 times and they had workers eating. There are people out there, you just need to find them. That's an interesting point, and I don't want to take away from you, Whitney, but our founder, Dr. Tom Mahan, I can hear him say this over and over again. There's plenty of people out there to do the work that needs to be done. They're just working somewhere else. And if you can create an environment where you are engaging and you are retaining your employees, but you're also selecting the right people up front so that you don't have those constant bad fits. You don't have those constant coworker issues. I mean, it's just, there's so many things about getting the front end right that I think we know that it's going to have some correlated impacts on employee turnover. There's still more to it than that. We know that because we've got to have data related to what is causing the turnover, and it's not always a selection process. But we certainly know that the better we're doing that, the better we're going to be able to impact it overall.
And that's why I started by saying I think the synergy between what you do and what I do is so important. You have to be attacking it from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
We can hire better employees all day long and still run them off once they get in the door. We can also retain bad employees that we shouldn't have hired in the first place. And so those have to be working together if we expect to see any meaningful change in the organization.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining today. As Whitney mentioned, we are going to be sending out the slides. We'll be sending out links to the articles that she mentioned. If you want to get in touch with Whitney, feel free to reach out to us and we can make that connection for you. Because we're actually trying to find ways to work together more. So we just have so much respect. I think I'm speaking for you, Whitney, and we respect each other's organizations and what we do. And we think there's a lot that we could be doing together. So if anybody wants to talk more about the work that Whitney does, then feel free to reach out to us and we'll get everybody connected and talk through that. But Whitney, I can't thank you enough for doing this. Every time I see you speak and hear about the work that you do, I'm just so impressed. I did want to sort of make a point, and that is that if I understand your organization correctly, Whitney, you mentioned you don't have a single assessment that you use. You go into organizations and you evaluate what's going to be best for them. So you're not walking in with a particular assessment or a particular style. It's really all about trying to find all the different things that they can do to make that selection better. And it's likely that some sort of an assessment will be part of it. Is that a correct
Yes,
statement?
thank you for mentioning that. And sometimes that's a really easy decision and sometimes it's harder, but I can kind of help on any point. You know, sometimes it's people are just calling me and they're like, we're looking for a test that does this. And I'm like, oh yeah, here's the contact name, you know. And other times it's, we really need help thinking through what the heck we want to select for. And then I have a kind of established process for that and everywhere in between. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
Well, again, thank you so much. Somebody asked if you're going to receive the presentation, and the answer is yes. So we will be sending that out as well. But Whitney, again, thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure you and I'll be talking very soon. And have a great rest of the week to everyone that joined us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Danny. I appreciate the opportunity. And thank you guys who were here live for making it engaging for me. And I look forward to talking to you soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.